August 16th, 1957, 11 p.m. The Worden hardware store in Plainfield, Wisconsin, stands empty. The owner, Bernice Worden, has vanished. A trail of blood leads to the back door. When police arrive at the farmhouse of Ed Gein, they discover something that will change American crime history forever. What they found hanging in that barn wasn't a deer carcass, as Gein claimed. It was Bernice Worden, dressed out like a hunter dresses a deer. But that was just the beginning. Inside the house, investigators would uncover horrors that would inspire Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Silence of the Lambs. This is the true story of Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield. This case shocked America in 1957 and continues to disturb people nearly 70 years later. What happened on that isolated Wisconsin farm remains one of the most grotesque and puzzling cases in criminal history. The man behind these crimes wasn't a violent serial killer in the traditional sense. He was something far more disturbing, a quiet handyman who lived alone and kept to himself, until the day police walked into his house of horrors. Before we unlock the full investigation, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Here at True Crime Vault, we bring you the true stories behind the cases that shaped criminal psychology and popular culture. New investigations every week. And if you think you know this story, trust me, the real facts are far more disturbing than any movie could show. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. His father, George Gein, was an alcoholic who struggled to hold down work. His mother, Augusta Gein, was a fanatically religious Lutheran who preached constantly about the immorality of the world, especially women. She believed all women, except herself, were instruments of the devil and vessels of sin. Augusta dominated the household completely. She ran a small grocery store to support the family, while George descended further into alcoholism. Ed and his older brother Henry grew up isolated from other children, forbidden from making friends, especially girls. Augusta would read to them from the Bible every afternoon, focusing on death, murder, and divine retribution. In 1914, Augusta moved the family to a 160-acre farm outside Plainfield, Wisconsin. She chose this location specifically for its isolation. She didn't want her sons corrupted by the outside world. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by woods, far from any neighbors. Ed and Henry were allowed to attend school, but Augusta made it clear they were only to go to school and come straight home. No friendships, no social activities, no interaction with the sinful world. Ed was a small, shy boy who struggled in school. Other children found him odd. He would laugh at inappropriate times, seemingly at random. He had trouble making eye contact. His classmates later remembered that he smelled strange, like the farm, like something old and musty. He was often the target of bullying, but he never fought back. He would just smile strangely and walk away. Teachers noted he was of average intelligence but seemed lost in his own world. At home, Augusta continued her religious indoctrination. She preached that women were prostitutes and instruments of the devil. She told her sons that sex was sinful and disgusting. She controlled every aspect of their lives, what they ate, what they wore, when they could leave the house. Even as Ed grew into adulthood, he remained completely under his mother's control. He never dated, never had friends, never attempted to create a life separate from the farm. On April 1st, 1940, George Gein died of heart failure at age 66. His death was largely unnoticed and unmourned. He had been a ghost in his own home for years, pushed aside by Augusta's domineering presence. With George gone, Augusta tightened her control over her sons even more. But Henry, the older brother, had started to question their mother's teachings. He began to criticize Augusta to Ed, suggesting that their mother's obsessive control wasn't normal, that her religious fanaticism was harmful. Ed would hear none of it. He defended his mother fiercely. The relationship between the brothers grew strained. On May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were burning marsh vegetation on the property to clear the land. According to Ed's account, the fire got out of control. The brothers separated to fight the flames from different directions. When Ed couldn't find Henry, he reported him missing. Police and firefighters searched the property. Ed led them directly to Henry's body, which struck investigators as odd. How could he know exactly where his brother was if he claimed to have lost him in the smoke? Henry Gein was found lying face down in an area that hadn't been touched by fire. He had bruises on his head. However, the local sheriff ruled the death asphyxiation from smoke inhalation. No autopsy was performed. The death was officially deemed an accident. But questions remained. Had Ed killed his brother for speaking against their mother? The truth died with Henry that day. Now it was just Ed and Augusta, alone on the isolated farm. Their codependent relationship intensified. Ed had no one else. Augusta had successfully isolated him from any other human connection. He was 40 years old and had never been on a date, never had a friend, never lived anywhere but this farm under his mother's rule. Then, on December 29, 1945, Augusta suffered a stroke. The woman who had controlled every moment of Ed's existence was now paralyzed and helpless. Ed became her full-time caretaker. He fed her, bathed her, moved her from bed to chair and back again. He read her the Bible passages she loved. He promised her he would never leave, never bring sin into their home. But Augusta suffered a second stroke a few months later. On December 29, 1945, exactly 1 year after her first stroke, Augusta Gein died. She was 67 years old. Ed was devastated. He was now completely alone. The only person who had ever mattered to him was gone. Neighbors would later report that Ed boarded up all the rooms his mother had used. Her bedroom remained exactly as it was the day she died. The parlor where she read the Bible stayed untouched. He lived in only a small portion of the house, a kitchen and a bedroom adjacent to it. The rest became a shrine to Augusta Gein. What happened next is where the story gets disturbing. Ed discovered that the Plainfield cemetery held visiting hours. He began spending time there, wandering among the graves. He read obituaries in the local newspaper obsessively, especially those of women around his mother's age. He attended funerals of people he didn't know. According to Ed's later confessions, between 1947 and 1952, he made nighttime visits to 3 local cemeteries, Plainfield, Hancock, and Spiritland. He exhumed bodies of recently buried middle-aged women who resembled his mother. He would dig them up, take them home, and this is where accounts vary. He claimed he sometimes brought the entire body, but more often just took certain parts. Ed later told psychiatrists about his grave robbing in detail. He described being in a daze-like state during these excursions, as if he wasn't fully conscious of what he was doing. He claimed he sometimes couldn't remember the trips at all, waking up in the morning to find evidence of his nighttime activities. Psychiatrists would later diagnose this as a dissociative state. But Ed wasn't just a grave robber. Investigators would eventually confirm he committed at least 2 murders, though the true number might be higher. Mary Hogan owned Mary's Tavern in Pine Grove, Wisconsin, about 6 miles from Ed's farm. On December 8, 1954, a customer entered the tavern around 5 p.m. and found it empty. The cash register was open. There was blood on the floor and a spent .32 caliber cartridge. A trail of blood led to the parking lot. Mary Hogan, 51 years old, had vanished. Investigators found little evidence. No weapon, no witnesses, no clear suspect. The case went cold. But about a week after her disappearance, Ed Gein was at a neighbor's house when someone mentioned the missing tavern owner. Ed reportedly smiled and said, "She isn't missing. She's at the farm right now." Everyone assumed it was one of Ed's odd jokes. He often said strange things that people couldn't quite understand. Ed continued his quiet life in Plainfield. He was known around town as Odd Eddie, a handyman who did occasional work. He babysat for neighbors, which in hindsight is deeply disturbing. Parents trusted him. Children found him strange but harmless. He would sometimes gift items to people in town, odd handicrafts he claimed he made. The truth about these gifts would later horrify those who received them. On November 16, 1957, the Saturday before hunting season, Bernice Worden ran Worden Hardware and Implement in Plainfield. She was 58 years old, a well-liked member of the community. Her son, Frank Worden, was the deputy sheriff. That Saturday morning, Bernice opened the store as usual. Ed Gein had been in the store the previous evening, Friday night. He told Bernice he would return Saturday to buy antifreeze. Store records show this conversation. Bernice wrote it in her sales book. Saturday afternoon, around 2:30 p.m., a customer entered Worden Hardware. The store was empty. The cash register was open. There was blood on the floor. A trail of blood led to the back loading door. Bernice Worden was gone. Frank Worden was out with the hunting party that day. When he returned and learned his mother was missing, he immediately went to the store. He saw the blood. He saw the open register. He found his mother's sales book, and the last entry read, Ed Gein, anti-freeze. Frank Worden knew Ed Gein. Everyone in Plainfield knew Ed. He was odd, but no one considered him dangerous. Still, Frank remembered the Mary Hogan case 3 years earlier. Same pattern. Blood, open register, vanished woman. And he remembered that strange comment Ed had made about Mary Hogan being at his farm. Sheriff Art Schley and Captain Lloyd Schuforster drove out to Ed Gein's farm around 6 p.m. on November 16th. The farmhouse was dark. Ed's truck was gone. They decided to wait and return with a search warrant. Ed, meanwhile, had driven to a neighboring town to visit a friend. When he returned to Plainfield that evening around 7:30 p.m., Sheriff Schley and other officers were waiting. They arrested him on suspicion of robbery, the only charge they had evidence for at that moment. Ed was cooperative. He didn't resist. He seemed confused about why he was being arrested. While Ed was being questioned, investigators obtained a search warrant and returned to his farm. It was now around 8 p.m., dark. They had flashlights and lanterns. They approached the farmhouse cautiously, not knowing what they would find. They entered through the shed attached to the house. One officer shined his flashlight upward and saw what appeared to be a deer carcass hanging from the rafters, dressed and gutted. But as they looked closer, the shape wasn't right. The realization came in waves of horror. It wasn't a deer. It was a human body, decapitated, hung upside down by the ankles, split open from the genitals to the chest. It was Bernice Worden. She had been field-dressed like a deer. What investigators found inside the farmhouse has been described as a house of horrors. The inventory of items found is documented in official police reports, and it remains one of the most disturbing evidence collections in American crime history. I'm going to describe what was found based on official records, but I'll spare you the most graphic details out of respect. In the kitchen and living areas, investigators found what appeared to be bowls and other items made from human skulls. Chairs reupholstered with human skin. A shoebox containing 9 masks made from human faces, complete with hair. These weren't crude items. Ed had tanned and preserved these materials. He had spent time crafting them with disturbing skill. A vest made of human skin, complete with breasts attached, leggings made from human leg skin, a belt made from human nipples, socks made from human flesh, 4 noses in a cup, a pair of lips on a string, 10 female heads with the tops sawed off, used as bowls. Bernice Worden's heart was found in a pan on the stove. In Augusta's bedroom, the room Ed had sealed off, investigators found it pristine, untouched, exactly as she had left it. It was a shrine. The contrast between this clean, orderly room and the horror elsewhere in the house was stark. Ed had created a collection. Police would eventually connect some remains to grave robberies, but the condition and variety of the items suggested he had been collecting for years. Ed later admitted to exhuming bodies from at least 9 graves between 1947 and 1952. The most disturbing item, according to investigators, was a woman's suit made from human skin. Ed had meticulously stitched together a vest, leggings, and mask that he could wear. He confessed to wearing this suit and dancing around the farmhouse by candlelight. He wanted to become his mother, to literally inhabit a woman's body, specifically a body that resembled Augusta. Ed was taken to the Waushara County Jail. Interrogations began immediately. Captain Schuforster led the questioning. Ed was cooperative, almost cheerful. He didn't understand why everyone was so upset. To him, what he'd done made perfect sense. Ed confessed to killing Bernice Worden. He said he went to the hardware store Saturday morning. The store was empty. He took a rifle from the wall, loaded it, and when Bernice walked in from the back room, he shot her in the head with a .22 caliber bullet. She died instantly. He dragged her body to his truck, locked the store, and drove home. He hung her in his shed and field, dressed her like he would a deer. He planned to make items from her remains, as he had done with others. Regarding Mary Hogan, Ed initially denied involvement, but as evidence mounted, he eventually confessed. He said he'd driven to her tavern on the night of December 8th, 1954. Mary was alone, closing up. He shot her with a .32 caliber pistol and transported her body to his farm in her own car, which he later abandoned. He kept her head, which was found in his house. Ed claimed these were the only two people he killed. Investigators were skeptical. Remains from multiple bodies were found at his property, but Ed insisted the others came from graves. He described his grave-robbing expeditions in disturbing detail. He remembered specific cemeteries, specific graves, specific women. Investigators checked cemetery records and found disturbances matching Ed's descriptions. They exhumed several graves Ed mentioned. Some were empty. Some contained bodies with parts missing. The evidence supported his claim that most of his collection came from the dead, not the living. But questions remain. Did Ed kill more than two people? Some investigators believed he did. Disappearances in the region during those years were looked at again, but no conclusive evidence linked Ed to other murders. On November 21, 1957, just 5 days after his arrest, Ed was arraigned on charges of first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Worden. The courtroom was packed. People wanted to see the monster from Plainfield. But when Ed was led in, people were shocked. He didn't look like a monster. He was small, thin, balding, wearing thick glasses. He looked more like someone's grandfather than a killer. He smiled at the crowd. He seemed confused about why everyone was staring at him. The judge ordered a psychiatric evaluation. Ed was sent to Central State Hospital in Waupun, Wisconsin. Over the next several months, psychiatrists examined him extensively. Their findings were complex. Ed was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Doctors found him to be in a near-constant state of psychosis, unable to distinguish between right and wrong in any conventional sense. His relationship with his mother had been so deeply pathological that even 10 years after her death, she dominated his mind completely. He had never developed a normal sexual identity or any adult relationships. He was, in the clinical language of 1957, profoundly disturbed and had been for decades. On January 6, 1958, Judge Herbert Bundy ruled Ed Gein incompetent to stand trial. He was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. He would remain there for the next 10 years. Meanwhile, back in Plainfield, the community struggled to process what had happened. Ed's farmhouse became a morbid tourist attraction. Thousands of people drove out to see the House of Horrors. The property was eventually auctioned off in March 1958. The buyer intended to turn it into a museum, but locals were outraged. On March 20, 1958, the farmhouse mysteriously burned to the ground. Arson was suspected but never proven. Most townspeople were relieved. They wanted the physical reminder of Ed Gein erased. Ed's 1949 Ford sedan was purchased at auction by a carnival promoter who displayed it across the country as the Ed Gein Ghoul car. People paid to see the vehicle that had transported bodies. This exploitation continued for years until the car was stolen in the 1970s and never recovered. In Plainfield, people tried to move on, but the case had attracted massive media attention. Reporters descended on the small town. The name Plainfield became synonymous with horror. Locals resented the attention, the judgment, the fact that their quiet farming community was now known for producing America's most disturbing killer. What do you think drove Ed Gein to commit these acts? Was it purely his mother's psychological abuse, or was there something else? Drop your theory in the comments below. At Central State Hospital, Ed was a model patient. He was polite, helpful, even cheerful. He assisted with cleaning and maintenance. He seemed to enjoy having structure and people around him. Psychiatrists noted that removed from the isolation of the farm, Ed functioned reasonably well. The farm, the isolation, the shrine to his mother, these things had enabled his psychosis. Without them, he was just an odd, harmless old man. But the question of his trial remained. Throughout the 1960s, periodic evaluations assessed whether Ed was competent to stand trial. Every evaluation found him still psychotic, still unable to understand the charges against him or assist in his own defense. Then, in 1968, Ed's condition improved. A combination of medication and therapy had reduced his psychotic symptoms significantly. On November 7, 1968, 11 years after his arrest, Judge Robert Golmar ruled Ed Gein competent to stand trial. The trial began on November 7, 1968, in Wautoma, Wisconsin. Ed was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Worden. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence: Ed's confession, the physical evidence from his farm, the body in his shed. But Ed's defense team didn't dispute the facts. Their argument was simple: Ed was legally insane at the time of the murder. He could not tell right from wrong. He was driven by a psychotic break from reality that had lasted years, perhaps decades. The trial lasted 1 week. The jury heard testimony from psychiatrists, investigators, and townspeople. Graphic evidence was presented. Photos from Ed's house were shown. The courtroom listened to Ed's confession. Some jurors wept. On November 14, 1968, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. They returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Judge Golmar committed Ed to Central State Hospital for life. Ed Gein would never walk free again, but he also would never serve time in a prison. He was sent back to the psychiatric hospital where he'd spent the previous decade. He would live there for the rest of his life. In 1974, Ed was transferred to the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. He spent his final years there participating in therapy, watching television, and doing odd jobs around the facility. Staff members found him pleasant and cooperative. Visitors who met him in his later years described him as a fragile old man who seemed genuinely confused about why people were so interested in him. Ed Gein died of respiratory failure on July 26, 1984. He was 77 years old. He had spent the last 26 years of his life institutionalized. His death was noted in newspapers across the country. The headlines read, "Ed Gein, inspiration for horror films, dies." By 1984, Ed's story had indeed inspired a generation of horror. Robert Bloch's novel Psycho, published in 1959 and adapted by Alfred Hitchcock in 1960, was directly inspired by the Ed Gein case. Norman Bates and his obsession with his mother were based on Ed. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974 drew heavily from Ed's story. The isolated farmhouse, the furniture made from human remains, the mask made of human skin. The character Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, who wore a suit made from women's skin, was modeled after Ed Gein. Ed Gein became a cultural touchstone for horror, but often the real story was lost in the fiction. The movies made Ed's crimes seem more violent and more numerous than they actually were. In reality, Ed killed 2 people. He was not a serial killer in the traditional sense. He was a deeply disturbed man whose crimes were more about his psychological break from reality than about violence or sadism. What makes Ed Gein's case so disturbing isn't just what he did, it's the why. His crimes were the result of decades of isolation, psychological abuse, and a pathological attachment to his mother that prevented him from ever developing a normal identity. He couldn't form relationships. He couldn't understand women as real people. He was trapped in his mother's worldview that women were either sinful creatures or objects to be controlled. After Augusta died, Ed's psychosis manifested in his need to preserve her, to become her, to surround himself with physical representations of her. The bodies he exhumed resembled his mother in age and build. He was trying to bring her back, trying to become her, trying to never let her leave him. Psychiatrists who evaluated Ed concluded that he had never progressed beyond a child's emotional development. At 51 years old, when he committed his crimes, he had the emotional maturity of a young boy completely dependent on his mother. He had no understanding of death as permanent. In his mind, his mother could be brought back, could be recreated, could still be with him if he just tried hard enough. The Ed Gein case changed criminal psychology. It was one of the first cases where the concept of a psychotic break and maternal obsession were examined in such detail. It influenced how law enforcement and psychiatrists understood the connection between childhood trauma, isolation, and criminal behavior. It also changed how small-town America viewed itself. Plainfield was a quiet farming community where everyone knew everyone. The idea that someone like Ed Gein could live among them for decades without anyone realizing what he was doing shattered the sense of safety and community trust. After Ed Gein, people locked their doors. They paid more attention to the odd neighbor. They questioned what might be happening behind closed doors. Today, Plainfield has moved on as much as any town can from such a legacy. The farm is gone, burned down decades ago. The property has changed hands several times. New buildings stand where Ed's house once stood. Most residents prefer not to talk about Ed Gein. They're tired of being associated with him. They want their town to be known for something other than America's most disturbing case. Ed Gein is buried in Plainfield Cemetery, ironically the same cemetery where he exhumed some of his victims. His grave is unmarked, but visitors have worn a path to where it's located. For years, people stole the grave marker as a souvenir. Eventually, the family stopped replacing it. Now, there's just a sunken patch of ground where Ed Gein lies. Bernice Worden is buried in the same cemetery, not far from Ed. Mary Hogan is buried in another local cemetery. The women whose graves Ed disturbed were reburied after their remains were identified and examined. Some families chose to relocate the graves to other cemeteries away from Plainfield. The case of Ed Gein remains a subject of study in criminal psychology courses. His psychological profile, his relationship with his mother, his inability to form normal attachments, all of these factors are used to understand how isolation and abuse can create profoundly disturbed individuals. But beyond the psychology, beyond the horror films, beyond the morbid fascination, there are real victims in this case. Bernice Worden was a 58-year-old woman running a hardware store, trying to make a living in a small town. Mary Hogan was a tavern owner, a known face in the community. They had lives, families, friends. They deserve to be remembered as people, not just as victims of Ed Gein. The families of both women struggled with the aftermath of the case. Frank Worden, Bernice's son, lived with the trauma of what happened to his mother for the rest of his life. He died in 1999, never fully recovering from the horror of that November day in 1957. If this case has taught us anything, it's the importance of recognizing isolation and abuse. Ed Gein was created by his environment, by a domineering, mentally unstable mother who isolated him from any normal human contact. He never had a chance to develop normally. He never learned to form healthy relationships. He never understood boundaries or appropriate behavior. Could his crimes have been prevented? That's the question that haunts many who study this case. If someone had intervened, if social services had existed in rural Wisconsin in the 1920s and 30s, if neighbors had reported the obvious abuse and isolation Ed suffered, could he have been helped before he became what he became? We'll never know. What we do know is that Ed Gein's story is a reminder that monsters aren't born, they're made. They're created by abuse, isolation, mental illness left untreated, and a society that looks the other way when something seems wrong. Ed Gein spent his final years at Mendota Mental Health Institute watching television and working in the facility. He died quietly, surrounded by medical staff, far from the farm where he committed his crimes. He was cremated. Some of his ashes were reportedly scattered at an undisclosed location, though this was never confirmed. The house is gone. The shed where Bernice Worden's body was found is gone. The physical evidence has long since been destroyed or lost. All that remains are the court records, the photographs in police archives, and the memory of what happened in Plainfield, Wisconsin in 1957. And that memory, that's what we're left with. A quiet handyman who smiled strangely and kept to himself turned out to be living in a house filled with human remains. A man so psychologically damaged by his upbringing that he couldn't function in normal society. A man who inspired an entire genre of horror films, but whose real story is more tragic than terrifying. Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, the inspiration for Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Silence of the Lambs. But also just a deeply damaged man who never had a chance at a normal life, who never received the help he desperately needed, and who ultimately destroyed not just his victims, but any chance he had at redemption or understanding. Today, Ed Gein remains a figure of morbid fascination. Books have been written about him. Documentaries have been made. Websites dedicated to true crime discuss his case endlessly. But often lost in that fascination are the real people, Bernice, Mary, and the women whose graves were desecrated. They deserve to be remembered not as Ed Gein's victims, but as individuals who had their dignity stolen, both in life and in death. If you found this deep dive into the Ed Gein case insightful, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Vault for more investigations into the cases that shaped criminal history. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your thoughts. What do you think could have prevented Ed Gein's descent into madness? Could early intervention have changed the outcome? Let me know below. And remember, these aren't just stories for entertainment. These are real events that affected real people, real families, and real communities. These cases deserve to be examined with respect and understanding. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never forget the human cost behind the headlines.